Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 56 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin. And Gavin, we are doing this. Is this now technically our third year of this podcast?
In the same way that it's year 3 of COVID,
that
where it's like,
isn't it year 4 of COVID? Because it's COVID-19. It started in 2019.
I guess.
So we are in our third year of this podcast in the same way that COVID-19 is in its fourth year of being, everywhere.
Yeah.
Omnipresent. But yeah, this is
note.
This is the first episode we are recording in the new year.
Yeah.
But if you haven't been paying super close attention, and why aren't you at this point? You may have missed something that came in between this episode and our last episode. Gavin, what did we do?
So, if you remember, all the way back to, I believe, episode 49, if I'm not mistaken. I don't actually have that note sheet in front of me, but I'm like 80% sure that episode 49 was about the paleontology of the Pokemon franchise.
It was not that long ago.
Yeah. But during that episode, I had a really good time because I know what these Pokemon look like. But Mike, I feel like I didn't do a good enough job describing either the Pokemon
feel like you did
the fossil Pokemon or the actual real life fossils that they are based on.
I feel like you did as good of a job as could have reasonably been expected, but there's just no substitute for the actual visual.
Exactly. So what we did is we recorded at least a part 1 of me showing Mike these fossil Pokemon in the game. So that is a YouTube exclusive video. You'll find the link to our YouTube channel down below in the show notes. We're not going to do a ton of those YouTube exclusive things, but there'll be a non-zero amount. So if you don't want to miss those, make sure to subscribe over there.
It's not going to be a regular thing, but it'll be kind of like, when it comes up in your subscription feed, like, oh, this is a thing I should check out. Nice little surprise, once every, it'll probably be pretty irregular where we won't upload for a couple months and then it'll be 3 videos in a week.
Right. So, and it's like I do upload every regular episode as a video to YouTube. I try to do it the same day it goes out, but with my work schedule, that's not always the case. Usually it's the Friday or Saturday after the episode goes up, wherever you listen to this podcast. But so occasionally there will be an exclusive video where we mention it on here, but we don't really go too much into it. So there will be a part 2 for that Pokemon video coming sometime. We haven't set a date for when we're going to do that, but sometime relatively soon.
Yes, once Gavin's able to get out of the hotel room that he has found himself in once again.
Yeah.
The omnipresent hotel room.
Yeah. Which might not be for a little while, but at least, when we typically record. I will be home on weekends, but we don't tend to record on weekends. But anywho, this episode is really exciting because it is a good episode for us to have for our first for the new year. And that is because it was actually recommended to us via the topic suggestion form down also below in the show notes by Mike and I's best good friend, Kate.
Ooh, Kate!
Yeah.
Kate, thank you very much for the idea. You had mentioned this before and I forgot it, but yeah, Kate.
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about manatees and their relatives, which are really interesting because I knew that they had a fossil record. I didn't think it was particularly good, but it's better than I thought. So we're going to talk about that. Before we get into that, Mike, do you have a Today in History for us?
I absolutely do, Gavin. So let's... I'm trying to think of how I want to do this. I don't know if we want to do 20 question style, and you can see if you can narrow it down.
Ooh.
And I'll give you a hint to begin with.
I like that, putting the challenge back on me like I had the challenge for you for the calendar. I like it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So we'll do this, maybe not... Well, we'll do 20 questions, but we'll make them quick questions. So
sure.
The hint is that this has to do with an inanimate object.
Inanimate object.
Yeah, so it's like not... Go ahead.
Is it some kind of like weapon of war?
It is not a weapon of war.
Okay. Is it something made by an American?
I'm going to say yes. I assume there were like also non-Americans working on it, but yes.
Okay. So it's not the nuclear bomb because it's not a weapon. Is it anything to do with war?
No.
Is it only yes or no questions that I can ask you, or
I mean, traditionally yes, but I'll be a little flexible here.
can you
If you
give
want,
me a time frame?
1933.
1933.
You're up to 4 questions now.
Is it something to do with like a law that passed?
It is not. Not really. I assume again, this one of the things.
Right.
Assuming you
Not
could find laws
directly.
surrounding this. No, you would not. That would not be helpful.
1933. Is it about American history primarily?
This is not the kind of thing that you would
Primarily.
learn. Yeah, this is not the kind of thing you would learn in an American history class. But it is a part of. I will say more a part of Americana than
Oh.
textbook American history. I think we're up to 6 questions.
I'm very not good at these types of games.
I will give you. I'll give you one final hint. We'll count this as
Okay.
question 7. It is an architecture feat.
Architecture feat. 33. That wasn't the Hoover Dam, was it?
It is not the Hoover Dam.
Okay.
January 5th, 1933, construction began on this architectural feat.
Is it in New York?
It is not in New York.
Is it in Washington?
It is not in Washington. You are, I believe, 10 questions in now.
I have nothing.
On January 5th, according to Britannica.com, on January 5th, 1933, in San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge began construction.
Neat.
And so again, I assume there was laws and things surrounding that and lots of different people.
I'm
but
sure.
Yeah, more just like an architectural feat, and it's in the opening credits of Full House, I think, and every disaster movie has a great scene where the Golden Gate, it snaps and like that's that tears America apart or something, or that's a signal of the times.
And even though I've lived in California for about 6 months now, I've still not seen it.
My understanding is that California, not that dissimilarly from New York, is just so wildly big as to say, if you live in
California's like 3/4 of the coast, so
right, yeah. So like just saying that you live in California probably is not all that helpful.
I've been up in that area, but not quite to San Francisco. I've been to Monterey, which is I think about an hour south, but interesting. This is gonna make me seem maybe a little strange. It's also heavily featured in the show Charmed, which an early 2000s TV show about witches that my sister watched quite a lot of, and because she was my older sister, she had control of the remote, and so I also watched it, and it was much better. It's not something that I would have watched as a young, male child by myself, but I'm glad that I watched it, and I'm going to leave it at that.
Fair enough. So that is January 5th, 1933. But we are, of course, here to talk about manatees, which I know nothing about. So, Gavin, start doing science stuff.
So, manatees. Manatees, this is directly from my notes. Manatees are very strange mammals doing very strange things, strangely. And the next bullet says potentially short episode, but no, this is going to be maybe even a little long, because like I said, when I started writing this episode, I didn't think they had that good of a fossil history, but I was wrong. So, Mike, what is a manatee?
Damn it. Okay. What is...
As is tradition for anytime we talk about a group of animals for an episode, what is this thing to you?
What is things, when you get down to it? All right, so here's the thing. So every time I think manatee, I always have to remind myself, not that this comes up all that often, but I know that I have had this like thought process in myself. Like manatees and walruses are separate things.
Yes, they
Even
are.
though for some reason I conflate them in my head, and I don't know.
And I understand why they superficially do look kind of similar,
right?
But they are not closely related at all.
Understood. So when it comes to manatee, again, I am thinking of an underwater animal. So I guess a marine animal might be the term.
Yep.
With some like weird, I don't know if trunk is the right word, but an elongated kind of flappy nose. and some fins that seem more useful, almost closer to like hands or arms than you might see on like a shark or a dolphin, at least traditionally.
Okay.
They have, and again, this is all just kind of going on my idea. They have sort of an elongated shape, um, where I, the only way I can describe this in my head, or I can describe this out loud, is sort of like a football shape that is much less pointy,
Okay.
where it's kind of like this oblong thing, and it's just kind of like this massive, not massive, but like mass of
Hmm.
animal without a whole
Okay.
lot of clearly defined shape. That's
I, I
about, I
I
think,
think
as good
that's
as I can get.
yeah. I think that's honestly like pretty good. The best way that I found to describe them are like a floaty gray potato.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually, you know what?
They're the vague shape of a potato with two little flappy arms, a
If we ever
round
start selling
paddle-shaped
merch,
tail,
if
and
we ever start selling merch, I want to sell like a T-shirt or like a flag or something that just has like a manatee and it's a floaty gray potato on it. That'll
right, just
be.
a potato with like the face of a manatee photoshopped onto it.
Yeah,
So,
that's
manatees, at least if you live in North America, the manatee that you are thinking of is the West Indian manatee, and we'll talk about modern manatee diversity like we usually do because
pause.
it's
So the North American manatee that I'm thinking of is called the West Indian manatee.
yes, that dates back to.
Are we going to get to that, or is that not even going to be part of the
We're not
discussion
really going to
today?
mention that.
All right, fine.
Just because that's when Europeans first got to North America, that's generally what the Caribbean was called.
Oh man, those bastards. All
Um,
right, fine.
so, yeah. Anyway, that's the one that you're thinking of. It's also called the Florida manatee. That's a subspecies of the West Indian manatee. Um, but so we will break down modern diversity and then get into the fossils. But first, I want to talk about these things because they're just very strange. So they are an order of mammals. So if you remember, kingdom, phylum, class, order. So they are an order of mammals, or at least in an order of mammals called Sirenia, which is named after the Greek sirens, of Greek mythology. And so they are not the only members of this group that are alive today. There are 3 species of manatee and 1 species of dugong, which we'll talk about as well. And so
I
there are
feel
only
like, have we mentioned that before, a dugong? Because that sounds familiar. Am I making that up?
yeah. So we talked about them a bit in the elephants episode for reasons I'll bring
Okay.
up in a little bit. Uh, but yeah, so there are 4 living species in this order today, and manatees are really unique in a lot of ways, but I think the most important one to point out immediately is that they are aquatic mammals, which in and of itself is not super unusual. You've got your whales, you've got things like your walrus, like you said, walrus and other pinnipeds like seals and sea lions.
Hmm.
You've got other semi-aquatic things like otters, hippos, things like that. So mammals living in the water is not entirely unusual, but
It is less common than not. Correct me if I'm wrong, but not
yeah,
rare.
right. But these guys are unique in that they're the only mammals to do it while being herbivorous.
So
Everything else,
they're
so with being fully aquatic, obviously hippos are herbivorous. Lots of semi-aquatic things throughout mammal history have been herbivorous, but these guys cannot leave the water. They don't even have back legs anymore. So these are the only fully aquatic mammals to ever be herbivorous.
okay. That is a sort of like an odd pairing there, but the only ones to do it, good for them.
Yeah. And so these guys are extremely derived, which means that they are very different than their ancestors. If you looked at the ancestors of these guys, you would not be like, oh, yeah, clearly that's related, without, knowing what skeletal things to look for. Like I said, they have no back legs. They have their front legs have been turned into flippers that notably still have toenails, which makes them different than like whales, which don't have nails on their flippers anymore. I don't believe there might be like a species that has them, but I don't think so.
Can we do an episode on, like, I don't want to get into this now, but like, can we do an episode on toenails and fingernails and stuff? Because that's something that's always seemed odd to me. It's like,
I
why?
can try.
All right.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting. I never really thought about it too much,
That's
but obviously there's a
for
difference between like claws and nails. Like
right. I mean, maybe,
your
let's talk
nails are
about that.
different than like the claws of your cat or dog.
Put it on the spreadsheet. Talk
Yeah,
about it later.
I will put that on right now.
All right, and we do have a lot to get through today. So back
Yep.
to
So,
manatees.
in 3/4 of the species, meaning all of the manatees, their tail is paddle shaped, and in the dugong, it is more fluked, like you would think of in a dolphin. Um, they have a very mobile upper lip, like you were talking about, with sort of like a nose, like a walrus almost.
Is that what that
They
is? It's a lip.
Yeah, it's just their lip, so it doesn't like extend super off their face. It's what makes their face very rounded. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and in one of the species, I don't remember which one, but it can move each side of the lip independently,
Huh.
and so they use that for plucking vegetation and like all the seagrass that they eat, because that's primarily what they eat. And we'll talk a bit more about that once we talk about the individual species.
Okay.
So we're going to let's see. Let's break down a little bit of some of their relatives. So their closest living relatives are elephants, which, again, when I said they were really derived, they look absolutely nothing like their relatives, other than that they're big and gray and have a pretty mobile upper lip. That is pretty much it when looking from them to their close relatives. Uh, and so within that group, so those two form a group. The next closest relative are called Hyraxes, which, if you've never heard of them, you are forgiven. They only live in Africa, and they're not even particularly common there. But they are almost rodent-looking animals. They or look a lot more like a groundhog and a rabbit, sort of mixed.
A groundhog. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And then within that, they're also joined with aardvarks, golden moles, and another group called tenrecs, all of which live, I think, entirely in Africa, that form one of the major large-scale groups of mammals called Afrotheria. And we will circle back to that when we talk about the fossils. And so that basically just means, like I think I've said previously, that the suffix or prefix theria, or THER, if it's got like "ther" in its name, that usually refers to mammals. It means beast in, I think, Latin, and Afro just meaning from Africa.
Okay.
And you'll notice the one species of manatee I've mentioned so far does not live there. We'll talk about it. So the modern diversity. So there are two families, two genera, so one genus in each of those families, and 4 total species. So the manatees are in the family, and like I tried to look up how to pronounce this, because normally I'm pretty good with scientific names, but CHs always kind of trip me up, because in some languages they're pronounced CH, like in English. Some languages they're pronounced like a K, and it kind of swaps every now and then. So manatees are in
C
the
is really just a
genus.
tough word. Like that's just in
Yeah,
general. When you think about it, like just about every time you could use a C, there's another letter that would make that same sound.
well, and it's CH is the sound that I'm
Hmm.
concerned about, because, like I said, sometimes it makes the CH sound, sometimes it makes a K sound in like these Greek and Latin. But anyway, manatees are in the family. It's spelled Trichechidae, so there are 2 CHs, but I think it's pronounced Trichechidae. Sure. And they're in the genus Trichechis. And so across all 3 of these living species, these have a paddle tail instead of a more fluked dolphin-like tail. So it's a very round tail that looks more like an oar that's sort of tapered at like the very base of it toward the body, and then sort of spreads back out toward the
Mm-hmm.
end of the tail. And these guys have what I mentioned when I was talking in the elephants episode. I have it written down somewhere, 26, episode 26. When I said that elephants have what are referred to as marching molars, meaning that they only have one molar in each quadrant of the mouth. So like top right, top left, bottom right, top, or bottom right, bottom left. So in each sort of quarter of their mouth, they only have one tooth at a time. And that tooth just slowly moves forward and gets worn down as they use it. And then another tooth, that tooth will pop out and there'll be one other one to replace it, and so on and so forth.
That seems useful.
It's very useful, particularly if you're eating a whole bunch of really tough to chew material. So these guys and elephants are the only ones that do that in mammals. Some mammals have ever-growing teeth, where they have the same tooth. Well, they have their baby teeth like humans do, but then their adult teeth don't stop growing. Some rodents have that. Some rabbits and their relatives have that. And also, weirdly, I think like one species of kangaroo does that. I don't know.
Kangaroos.
Oh man, they're weird. But these guys and elephants are the only ones that do this marching molar thing. And something that just very irks me about manatees is that they have the wrong number of neck vertebrae.
Explain.
Mammals.
Okay, explain.
Mammals by default have 7 vertebrae in their neck. Which
what do you mean by default? Is that just like the normal number, or
that is the normal number that mammals have? Mammals are particularly not good at making more of them. Even things like giraffes, for as long of a neck as they have, still only have 7. Whereas other things, reptiles that have had really long necks, just sort of copy paste vertebrae and have, like some of the sauropods, sauropod dinosaurs or other reptiles that have long necks could have, dozens of vertebrae in their neck. Even like giraffes only have 7.
That seems to make sense. Like, is there an evolutionary disadvantage to growing more vertebrae? Like, is there a reason?
Not particularly. You just kind of have to have the mutation that allows for an extra one, and also have it not kill you.
Right.
So apparently that just never, that random mutation never happened in giraffes, which is why they never got it. But these guys and sloths are the only ones that differ from that in mammals. These guys have 6 instead of 7.
So they have less. Well, I guess
have less.
I say that kind of makes sense because they're, little potato boys or whatever you were calling them.
Yeah, I'm really not sure. I've never found a reason for why, but they just do. Dugongs do not. Dugongs have the normal amount from what I could find. It's just manatees. So the 3 species of manatees. First, like I said, there's the West Indian manatee, which is Trichechus manatus, like manatee.
Okay.
They get around 900 or so pounds and about 10 feet long, which honestly is lighter than I thought they would be.
You said 900?
Yeah, which is heavy for sure. But being in the water just kind of lets you don't have to carry your own weight anymore. The water carries it for you, which is why whales were allowed to be so big.
That is one of those things where like I have a hard time with scale, with a lot of different things. But yeah, like that, I can see them being heavier than that just by being strictly aquatic animals.
Yeah. And this is, this and one other species are about the same size. And there's one that's much smaller, but this is probably about the biggest modern manatee. The ones that you normally think, if you live in North America, the one that you are normally thinking of is about as big as they get today.
Okay.
They are found mostly in the Caribbean, and overall are listed as a species as vulnerable, but each of the 2 subspecies are listed as endangered. They're not doing too hot, which you probably know if you know anything about manatees, is that they get hit by boats a lot because they are just this kind of floaty sea potato.
Now, when it comes to that scale, does it just go like endangered and then extinct, or is there like subdivisions? Because we hear endangered species all the time.
Yeah.
But like, what does that mean for a species to be endangered? Is there a step between, is it like extinct in the wild, but we have zoos or something? Like,
Let me
how does this work?
Pull up like the formal designation here.
Yeah, because that's one of those things that's like we hear that so often, but I've never really taken the time to except for like maybe my third grade class, like we probably looked at
Yeah.
it there. But like, okay,
So the
what does it
scale
mean for a species
goes.
to be endangered?
Yeah, the scale goes least concern, which would be things like robins
Humans?
or crows, where it's like we don't even monitor how many of them there are because there are so many that they're not on our radar of things to be concerned about.
Okay.
Then there is near threatened, which is like, okay, there's a decline, things are
They're not on the radar.
they're on the radar but not nearly like a priority.
Hmm. Okay. We're not worried, but we're monitoring the situation.
Right. Then there is broadly the category of threatened, but within
Hmm.
threatened there is vulnerable, which is, hey, we should probably stop doing whatever we're doing that's bothering them.
Hmm.
Endangered, which is, hey, these could go extinct pretty easily if we don't stop what we're doing. And critically endangered, which is most likely this is going to go extinct.
Even like just stopping whatever our bad practices are, like probably isn't enough to fix the problem.
To an extent. But
Okay.
that would need like a lot of money and resources to rehabilitate that species and its habitats that it would need.
Right. It would take active work to save the species instead of just trying to stop killing it like that.
Right.
Okay.
And then there is extinct in the wild, so still present in zoos, things like that, and then extinct.
Gotcha. Okay. So
So
endangered
each
is
of the
not good.
subspecies are endangered, but the species as a whole is vulnerable,
That is
if that makes
interesting.
sense. Because the two species or subspecies can interbreed, but they tend not to. Subspecies, for me as a paleontologist, is not something that I'm that super familiar with because in fossils we don't really do that.
Hmm.
So that's almost entirely a modern thing. So
Right.
I don't really know what exactly goes into having things be a subspecies instead of a species. At the end of the day, it's a little arbitrary, but anyway. Technically, and this kind of surprised me, this species can be found all the way from Massachusetts, which is more north than I thought it was going to be, all the way down to Brazil, which is also more south than I thought they would be. But they mainly are found in Florida and the Caribbean.
Hmm.
And they are especially well known for having their big lip. They have a very big, noticeable. If you look at it from the front, it's very rounded. If you look at it from the bottom, it's very flat. And they have all manatees, and I think dugongs too, have a lot of whiskers on their lip. Their lip is really, really sensitive. That's mostly what they use to sense their environment. Their eyesight's probably not great, especially this next species that I'm going to talk about, which is the Amazonian manatee. These are manatees that live in the waters just outside of the Amazonian River down in South America, and this is Trichechus inunguius. This is the smallest modern Sirenian, so member of this larger group, including dugongs. And these only weigh around 550 pounds. So much smaller, although not too much shorter. So they're just a bit more slender. So they can get up to around 8.5 feet long, but almost, half the weight.
Okay.
Instead of being sort of that sort of pale gray that you sort of think of with manatees, these ones are a more dark gray. So probably to try and blend in. The Amazon is notoriously very murky. And they have a white or sort of pinkish patch on most of their chest and sort of the upper part of their stomach. And this one is sort of unique for actually lacking those nails on its flippers. All the other ones have it, but these guys don't. They're native to the Amazon basin in Brazil, Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. And they are also listed as vulnerable, but it is really hard to tell because they live in the Amazon. The water's really murky, so you can't just like fly a helicopter or a drone or something and try and look for them. You can't see that they're there unless they're like right at the surface, and that's even assuming that you can see the river from the air, that the trees haven't grown over top of it.
I imagine you have to do like a lot of indirect measurements, and I'm not sure what that would be, but you can't just count them.
So something that I actually did when I was down in Belize. So I actually saw some West Indian manatees like in person. It was super cool.
Hmm.
But something we were doing to try and get a population measure was we just took samples of water. So we would take just like a liter bottle of water and fill it at a particular spot, and then we would sort of try and get a concentration for manatee DNA in the water and use that as sort of a proxy for manatee population density. With a river, that'd be harder because presumably you would get everything upstream of where you were at. So that would really depend. You'd have to really heavily control for how much river there is upriver from you.
Mm-hmm.
So I bet it's possible, but really hard. But yeah, so a couple countries have management plans. Mostly Colombia has sort of the only real active management plan for helping these guys, but they are federally protected in Peru. But the rest of the countries, Brazil, Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, they aren't federally protected there.
So is there a like market for, dead manatees or parts of manatees?
I mean, they're big. They have a lot of meat. They have a lot of fat.
Okay, okay, food.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
And this is the only fully freshwater Sirenian. So the rest of them live at least partially in saltwater. The West Indian manatee lives mostly in saltwater, although, fun fact, I learned that they actually have to go to freshwater every handful of days to drink.
Huh.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep. So they just go and spend a few hours like in a river somewhere. And
Yes, they can't be too far away from fresh water.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And then lastly, the last species of manatee that we have today is the African manatee, which is Trichechus senegalensis, which is extremely similar to the West Indian manatee. It is maybe a little smaller, probably only averaging around 800 pounds instead of around 900. Not you wouldn't really notice that though, because they're basically the same size.
Mm-hmm.
They range all along the Atlantic coast of Africa, from Angola in the south up to Senegal, which is probably 2/3 of the African Atlantic coast. And total in 21 countries, because they also live in quite a few of the rivers that flow into that side of Africa, or the ocean on that side of Africa. So they are also listed as vulnerable. And apparently, this is the only Sirenian that will intentionally eat things besides plants.
Intentionally eat things besides plants. Okay, so we'll like intentionally eat, I assume, like small aquatic mammals or like krill or something.
Mostly mollusks, clams and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And if they
Right.
happen to come across a fish in a net, they won't pass that up either. Which,
Okay.
and I've said this a couple of times, no animal is completely herbivorous. I've seen videos of like horses eating little chicklets, or deer eating, baby birds and things.
But to the first order of magnitude.
Right. Yeah. So this is the only one that depending on the population of these, I think it said like in adults, like up to 50% of their diet was not plants. So,
Okay. Wow.
yeah. So those are the three manatees, and then lastly we have the dugong, which is in the family Dugongidae, and in the genus Dugong. And the species is Dugong dugon. They got very creative with these guys. And dugongs are generally much more slender than manatees, even if they are a bit heavier. They just have very, very dense bones. So these guys can be over 10 feet, but not very often. But they can weigh up to like 12,000 or 1,200 pounds.
So definitely significantly larger by several hundred pounds.
Yeah. And they are found in, depending on how you count it, over 40 or so countries all around the Indo-Pacific, basically the east coast of Africa, up into the Red Sea, which is that little area between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. They can live all the way up through there, northern Madagascar, western India, and then, Australia all the way up through Vietnam. So that entire stretch of like Indonesian islands, they live all through there. and they were also formerly native to several places like Hong Kong, Mauritius, Taiwan, Cambodia, Japan, but they are no longer there. They're also listed as vulnerable. And unlike manatees, these guys do not have the marching molars. That's just a manatee thing. So, which I find very interesting for reasons I'll bring up later. These guys have very simple peg-like teeth, and sort of kind of have tusks.
It seems as though as you're describing these that a lot of the different species here don't seem to have a whole hell of a lot in common.
So they do and they don't. Dugongs are very different than manatees.
Okay.
But the other ones, like looking at their skeletons, yeah, they're very clearly very similar. But these guys, with mammals, I've mentioned many times throughout this, the run of this podcast, mammals are very much identified by their teeth. So these guys, because their teeth are so different, they're very clearly, like, obviously they're related, but
right.
They're not at all in the same group as manatees. Yeah, and like I said, they have very small tusks. They don't come out of the mouth like you would think of in like a walrus or something, but they do have like cone-shaped, pointy front teeth. Okay. And this one is the only strictly marine Sirenian, so these guys do not have to go to fresh water to drink.
God, jeez. So these ones don't. Wow, I can't keep this. I'm going to be honest. I don't even know which is which. I don't remember what species can. Like I'm being honest here. Like this is.
That's okay.
Diagramming all this, yeah.
That's okay. But anyway, we have the 3 manatees. One in southern North America, one in the Amazon, and one on the other side of the Atlantic. And then the dugong, which is in the Indo-Pacific. So they do not overlap almost at all. Occasionally, the West Indian manatee, so the North American one, will overlap maybe a little bit with the Amazonian one, but almost not at all. So, and so those are the modern ones. And like I said, all of them are listed as vulnerable. So this is not as sad of a story as the rhinos episode was. But they are still, in general, not doing great.
So something to keep our eye on, I suppose.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
So that's the modern stuff. So let's get into some of the fossils. And these guys have kind of a strange fossil beginning. Like I've said also many times throughout this podcast, the beginning of most groups is always kind of a bit fuzzy because, like, the first members of a group are in general just kind of rare because they're the first ones. They haven't had a chance to spread out and into a lot of different areas and environments, and because they're rare, they just don't tend to fossilize very well. So, as I mentioned, Sirenians, and we're going to talk about the group as a whole, so I'm not just going to say manatees or dugongs. Now I'm just going to call them all Sirenians, the group that they're all in. So,
all right, so back to one name, back to generalities, right?
Yes.
Okay, I can handle this.
So, Sirenians, like I said, are most closely related to Proboscideans, the group that elephants are in. And also, with those two, there's an extinct group called the Desmostylians, which, depending on who you ask, might potentially be closely related to horses. Again,
if I'm asking you, is that true?
I don't know. With a lot of like the early mammal groups, things are just real weird. Not horses per se, but like the group that they're in with rhinos and tapirs. The order Perissodactyla. They could be there, they could be here. It's kind of tough. But most things that I read put them with these guys. So those 3 groups. Also those Desmostylians were also aquatic, but did it differently. They still had legs. So these 3 groups form a bigger group, because that's how taxonomy these days works, is there's just groups inside of bigger groups inside of bigger groups. So Sirenians, elephants, and these Desmostylians together form a group called the Tethys, which is, and normally I wouldn't go into a group like this, but I want to talk about these sort of bigger scale groups for a little bit. So This group is named after the ocean that formed between the two supercontinents after Pangea broke up. So, like, we're going way back. Pangea. So, when Pangea broke up, it didn't sort of split apart like you blew something up. It sort of first mostly separated into the northern continents and the southern continents. So, the Tethys Ocean was the one that formed in the middle as the north continents moved northward and the southern continents moved southward. So, that central ocean was called the Tethys Ocean.
Mm-hmm.
And that happened in like the early Cretaceous. So that would be, 120 or so, maybe a little before, but in that general area, million years ago, which is generally not times that we talk about when we talk about groups of mammals that we still have today.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said earlier, the Sirenians, elephants, and then some other weird groups, those Hyraxes, aardvarks, tenrecs, and golden moles, all form that group that I mentioned earlier called Afrotheria. Mammals, if you remember both of our mammals episodes that we've had, mammals are broken down into three big groups, which are monotremes, the platypus and echidna, the ones that lay eggs, marsupials, things like opossums, kangaroos, koalas, etc., and placentals, everything else. Placentals are then broken down into three other big groups. I don't know why it's three. That's just kind of how it works.
Right.
The other two, which are Xenoarthra, which today would be sloths, anteaters, and armadillos, and the Boreoeutheria, which is everything else besides these Afrotherians. So this is a major early split within placental mammals, which is why these guys and elephants are so strange, because they split off so early compared to some other mammals,
Because they had more time to evolve differently because it was so early on in the process. Is that the point?
Exactly. That's
Okay.
why some they just do things very strangely, like those marching molars. That's a
Mm-hmm.
real weird thing to do for a mammal, and a lot of other things just about some of their bone structure, some of their metabolism is a little funky, and that's also the case with Xenoarthrins. Xenoarthrins are also real weird. We'll have an episode about them eventually. We talked about them quite a bit in our Great American Biotic Interchange episode.
Mm-hmm.
But Xenoarthrins are real weird and real cool, so I'd love to do an episode about them one day. But anyway, so when these three groups split is a little bit unsure, but genetic information seems to sort of suggest that it was around 105 million years ago. So this was something that I did not know when I did our mammals part 2, that this split happened this long ago. I definitely thought this would have been much closer to the end of the Cretaceous, but this was like middle Cretaceous. This was pretty far back. But what's really interesting though is, so like I said, the Afrotheria are African animals. But at 105 million years ago, Africa was on its own. It was an island continent by that point. So
Mm-hmm.
that split probably happened somewhere a bit before that even.
Wow. Okay. So wait, at what time are we talking about now? How many years back?
105 million at
Okay.
least.
So we're getting pretty far back now, even
Yeah.
in the context of geologic history of the Earth.
Yeah. And so and this is again from genetic stuff. We do not have good fossils from this split. This is
Mm-hmm.
all just based on genetics, which as a somebody who studies like the actual bones and stuff, I inherently find it a little hard to put some stock in, but I don't really understand genetics that well, so I guess I'll trust them. So anyway, all of that to say, this group is real old, but also very evolutionarily important, which is why I wanted to talk about it. Otherwise, I would have just started at the start of Sirenians. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't think I'll ever get a chance to talk about, Afrotheria as a whole again, just because none of the other groups are interesting to me besides elephants, which we already did. So, but yeah, so back to Sirenians. The first Sirenians appear in the early Eocene, which is sometime around 50 to 55 million years ago. So we're taking a 50 million year jump to when we actually see the first real Sirenians. When they split with elephants, that's also a little unsure. Probably closer to 65, pretty much right after the end Cretaceous mass extinction.
Yeah, after those dinos.
Yeah. But so by the middle of the Eocene, which is, a few million years later, probably 50 to 45-ish million years ago, they're already crossing the oceans.
Okay.
So we don't have good fossils from how they developed the ability to do that because, like I said, this was an entirely African group until suddenly they just kind of weren't. Because we find two of the most basal, meaning, the most ancestral Sirenians, basically at the same time in both Spain, which, and trust me on this, is not in Africa, and also Jamaica, which, again, trust me on this, is not in Africa.
this is true. Jamaica.
And this is true. So they're found on complete different sides of the Atlantic Ocean at the same time. So it's like, well, not quite sure how you got there from Africa, but I guess you did. So the Spanish one is called Sobrara Basiren. There's a lot of siren in these names. And the Jamaican ones, because there's multiple that are old and also ancestral, are called Prorostomus and Pizosiren. And I like throwing these names in case you want to do a little research for yourself out there.
If anybody at home wants to do that, go for it. I will not be.
But yeah, so
because I can't spell any of these, and they're going like
exactly, yeah, but that's okay. And so, but like I said, there were two of them in Jamaica at the same time, in like the Middle Eocene, which is less than 5 million years after the group first shows up to begin with. So, real strange because it's like, yeah, the continents were closer together than they are now, but not by that much,
Right.
So, and what's interesting about these guys is that they still had 4 legs. They did not have the paddly tails, and they were not nearly as big as modern Sirenians are. They were like roughly pig-sized. So it's like that is a long journey for a little pig-sized thing to make and not die on the way.
Right. Like, what were they eating along the way?
I have no idea. And that's especially, and I just thought about this now. I don't have this in my notes. I'm really curious because if even modern manatees have to still go get fresh water every couple of days, how did this one do it? I don't know. But they did somehow. And by the end of the Eocene, around 34 million years ago at this point, the family Dugongidae appears and was fully aquatic. So there are 2 older families that were not fully aquatic. Those are the ones that still had the legs. But by the end of the Eocene, dugongs appear fully aquatic, basically look like modern dugongs. The manatee family, Trichachidae, appears in the latest part of the Eocene, or potentially the early Oligocene, which was also around this time, probably a little more closer to 30 million years ago. So a little bit after the dugongs, but likely evolved from the earliest dugongs. So they split really early. And something that I just threw in here because this also really blew my mind. And I'm like, these guys are just so strange. The early Sirenians, and I don't remember if the earliest dugongs still had this, but the ones that still had all 4 legs did. They had an extra premolar. So
an extra, okay.
So in your mouth, and I've talked about teeth a whole bunch on this podcast, but
yes,
in your mouth, there are 4 different kinds of teeth. There are your incisors, the flat ones in the front, canines, the pointy ones, premolars, the ones that are kind of pointy, kind of flat, and then the molars in the back that are mostly flat. And so the default condition for mammals is 4 premolars on each quadrant. Humans only have 2, so you are missing 2 of them, but you're supposed to be. Don't freak out. These guys had 5, which is just strange.
That's significant. Yeah,
and it's like mammals in the past, like the very, very early mammals had 5, but like they got rid of that fairly early. I think. And even like the source that I read that in was like, we're really confused by this, because it's like, did they re-evolve it, or were they somehow part of a lineage that still just kept it the whole time? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. So I think it was leaning toward they re-evolved it, and then by the time we got to dugongs and manatees, they lost it again. I don't, like I said at the beginning,
right.
This is just a strange group doing strange things, strangely.
More research needs to be done.
Yeah. So, Sirenians in the Oligocene do really well. As well as into the early Miocene, so this would be roughly 34 to roughly 20 million years ago. Manatees, throughout their entire history, all the way up through today, were much less diverse than dugongs. We'll talk about dugongs more in a second, but around this time, manatees have members like Anamatherium, which is great, and Miosiren, like Miocene siren. Mm-hmm. And both those were found in Europe, which is not where they're found today. And in South America, we have Potamosiren, which means river siren, which I think is cool. And also Ribodon, showing up in the middle and late Miocene in South America. And then we just kind of have like a 5-ish million year gap without any manatee fossils.
How unusual is that? Like I believe we've talked
not
about this
super
kind of thing
unusual.
Like, I was gonna say that seems like the kind of thing that's just that seems to happen when you've got this many millions of years to deal with. Like it might not be as weird as it first sounds to just not have fossils for that length of time.
Yeah, but it means we don't have a good transition to how modern manatees got where they are. Like, to my knowledge, and this very well might be a sampling thing, like we just haven't looked all that hard in Africa, because of lots of historical and financial reasons. But to my knowledge, the African manatee has no fossil record.
Wow.
Or at least not more than a few thousand years. But there is one species in the modern manatee genus, Trichechus, that is also from South America. So it's possible that this genus originated in South America, and then the one species stayed there to become the Amazonian manatee, one moved north to become the West Indian manatee, and then one moved over to Africa across the Atlantic to become the African manatee. That was sort of, again, the general consensus, but it was like, we kind of don't know. So manatees don't have a great fossil record. Dugongs, on the other hand, have a great fossil record.
And is that just a factor of, where they are located or have been historically located, or is there a better reason for that?
See, I would generally say, yeah, but manatees generally
yes,
live...
to which part?
Like, just in general, because things, if you want to be fossilized, you want to live in shallow marine environments. That is like the best place to be fossilized, which manatees live, but at least at this point, there hasn't been a whole lot of time for what was shallow marine stuff 5 million years ago to be uplifted for us to now find, right? That's still underwater. So
okay.
There probably are manatee fossils out there. They're probably just still underwater.
And we have to put the time into to looking for them.
Or well, that's yeah. We kind of just can't. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Let me rephrase that. That would be what you would have to do.
Right. Or we'd have to put a lot more ice on the poles and lower ocean levels, which is not going to happen anytime soon.
I was going to say, how are we doing on that front? Yeah, if Al Gore would have not made that movie, then we'd be fine right now.
Damn it, Al. But yeah, so manatees in their entire fossil record have 5 genera and 10 species. That's it. Dugongs have 26 genera and 42 species from all over the world. So not just in the Indo-Pacific where they're found today, and doing lots of different things. So it's not just they were just regular dugongs just kind of everywhere. These were all doing very different things from each other. There were some that looked more or less like today's dugong, but some were doing some real different things. So I'm going to highlight a couple of the favorites. So one of them was Rhytiotis from the Miocene of Europe and also northern Africa. So like Mediterranean area. And it was around 20 feet long, which is about twice as long as today's dugongs, and had these short little tusks for rooting around in sand. These ones did come out of the mouth, basically like a walrus tusk, but much, much shorter. So these were superficially very walrus-like, and they even still have like the bristly face and everything like walruses do. And
like
so,
if I looked at that, I would be like walrus.
Especially if they just had their head popped out of the water, 100% you'd be like, oh, that's a strange walrus.
Okay.
And then on the other side of the spectrum, there is Nanosiren from the latest Miocene of Chile, as well as all the way through the southwestern United States. So it's kind of just all the way up the coast. It was only about 6 feet long and may have only weighed about 350 pounds and is the smallest Sirenian that we know of. Just a little cute guy.
How big did you say he was again? Like how much did he weigh?
About 6 feet long and about 350 pounds.
That's way smaller than the other ones we talked about.
Yeah. But you can't have a podcast episode talking about Sirenians without talking about probably the most famous extinct Sirenian.
Oh, is this one I would know?
Maybe after I say it.
Okay.
So the species is Hydrodamylus gigas, more better known by its common name, which is Steller's sea cow.
Ooh, sea cow. This you have tickled the nerve.
Sea cow is a general term for Sirenians in general.
Okay.
But Steller's sea cow is a very unique one because it was likely the largest Sirenian ever, at least the largest one that we know of, being around 30 feet long. So at least 20 feet longer than the biggest manatee today, biggest Sirenian today, and potentially weighing up to 10 tons, which is the max size that like elephants get today. Wow. This was a huge animal.
Yeah. That really, I mean, the range. Part of what I'm struck by in this episode is, this is an episode about manatees and just the range of size as well as everything else. The differences, the range and sizes and the differences between all of them from 350 to what was this number again?
Around 10 tons.
So
like 20,000 pounds.
Right. So like a lot of pounds. Like that's This is part of what's kind of just like I'm having a hard time processing.
Yeah.
This and it's obviously very clear, just like the diversity in this one species throughout time. Was this? Did you say this was an extinct one, or is this we're still rolling today?
Yep. So this is an extinct one.
Okay.
And it lived in. It was unique among all Sirenians because from what we can tell, they're pretty much all like warm water. This one lived in cold water. Wow. This one lived up around the Aleutian Islands of Alaska and in the general like northern Pacific area. And it was.
I guess this makes a little more sense just because it's extinct and giving quite a bit of latitude for things to evolve and change just over the time. But even still, just that's part of what is kind of getting me with this episode.
Oh, we're not done talking about this guy because this guy's special.
Oh, please keep going.
So yeah, it has some potentially ancestral species that were also found in the area as well. Like their fossils have been found up there, but pretty much it's just this genus that is found in the cold water. All the rest are in generally pretty warm waters. It mainly fed on kelp because there's not really seagrass per se up there, which is mostly what manatees and dugongs eat. So mostly fed on kelp. but it kind of just didn't have any teeth. Instead, it
Mm-hmm.
had these plates made out of keratin, the same material that your fingernails and hair are made out of. It had one on its top jaw and one on its bottom jaw. And it just sort of grinded the kelp together on the plates and ate it that way.
Hmm.
And we know
Okay.
a
Right.
ton about this thing's anatomy and many other things about this animal because we killed the last of them in
Oh no.
1768.
Oh,
This is
17.
right. So this is not nobody alive today is at
Right.
fault for
It's
this.
not your fault.
Right. But what's very famous about stellar sea cow is that they were discovered by Europeans in 1751 and only lasted 27 years after that. So,
Wow.
to be fair to the
They were
Europeans,
almost certainly on their way out.
yeah. So they were likely going to go extinct soon anyway. There was only around, depending on what source you kind of look at, around 1,500 to 2,000 of them left in the wild at that point. And because they're so recent, we have actually decent genetic information about them, and it looks like they were like extremely inbred.
Yeah. So really, it seems as though Europeans had very little to do with it. I assume it's possible they may have sped it up, but this was a species
Right.
on the way out.
Right. And it's like, as with many large bodied things that were around during the Ice Age, they just also didn't do well. Like, yeah, they were cold adapted, but like living that far north to begin with, and then the Ice Age happens, you're not doing all that hot. Yeah, the Ice Age really didn't do them any favors. And also, it wasn't just the Europeans hunting them. Like, native peoples also hunted them, you know, probably not like to extinction, but they were also, a factor.
Mm-hmm.
But once the Europeans got word of, in my notes it says a big defenseless meat sack that they could get several thousand pounds of meat out of, they would purposefully redirect their ships north when they didn't have to. That wasn't part of like their normal trip. If they were like going across the Pacific, they would purposefully divert themselves north to pick up some of this nice meat and then go back south. So they would have gone extinct anyway, but Europeans definitely didn't help. And
Yeah.
so it's a little bit tragic, but it's actually a really fascinating story because the reason that they got discovered, quote unquote, by Europeans was because Stellar, the guy that they're named after, he was on a boat that shipwrecked on an island up there, and him and his crew were there for a year, and so this guy, who was a scientist, just started documenting all the animals while he was stranded there, and there was handwritten accounts of a couple unsuccessful attempts of trying to hunt one of these things because they would try and harpoon it and it just wouldn't work because it was too big and the harpoons just wouldn't go far enough into the skin to be able to for them to be able to like drag it onto shore. So if you want to look into stellar sea cow, like it's going to be a little sad, but it's actually a really interesting sort of like survival story. It could be a really cool movie.
we once that movie gets made, we will watch it and discuss it on this show if we have any aspiring
we sure
filmmakers
will
in the audience.
But yeah, so that is pretty much manatees. Like I said, I thought that manatees going into this didn't have a great fossil record, and for manatees, I was kind of right. Dugongs really surprised me because they're only a quarter of modern Sirenians. There's only one species of them left, but as fossils, they were everywhere and like super diverse. So, thank you, Kate, for helping me learn about manatees. It's a group that I've always been like, oh yeah, manatees, they're super cool and super weird, but I've never actually taken time to learn anything about.
What I would like to know from Kate is why she suggested, like, did she know something that we didn't about just how friggin' weird these guys are? Or like what I want to know the why behind why this got suggested. So hopefully we can hear from Kate on this, but like a word to everybody else in the audience. We'll talk about whatever you want. Just tell us.
Yeah, absolutely. Fill out that suggestion form down below. And I should have said this at the beginning, but I forgot. if you filled out the form, I forgot. I did forget about it. I'm going to be honest, but I have seen them now, and we will get to that. Whatever you have suggested, we will get there.
Perfect. So I believe, unless I'm wrong, Gavin, this wraps up episode 56.
Absolutely.
So happy New Year, everybody! Happy 2022. I was listening to a podcast earlier today, and they just had their first episode of the new year, and they said, I am just as confident that 2022 will be better than 2021 as I was that 2021 will be better than 2020. So,
which, like,
I don't know exactly. I mean, it was, but
it was with so many. I mean, like, for me personally,
the bar
2021 was a great year. I graduated with my master's. I moved to California. I got engaged. I can't really complain. So 2021 was good to me, as horrible as it was for the world in general.
A lot of good moments for you, surrounded by existential dread.
Oh yeah, that's a great way to put it.
I suppose I can't complain all that much either. I finally got a real job that seems to be permanent, and as long as I don't get myself fired, which I almost did earlier this year, but we can put that aside.
You mean last year?
Another time? No, I mean this year. I mean like a month ago.
Right, but I mean today's only the 4th, Mike.
Oh,
gotcha,
Gavin.
That was last year. Put that stuff behind you. That's in the past.
I don't know if there's something else you need to.
New year, new me.
Like,
new year, new Mike.
Yet? Like, are you a dad yet? Because that was good dad.
Oh, new year, new Mike.
New year, exact same podcast, exact same Gavin and Mike, and we look forward to seeing you guys again, or to have you listen to us on episode 57. But as of now, this has been episode 56 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. I am Mike. That is Gavin. Happy New Year, everybody, and we will see you next week.